let's take a look at Israeli military targeting that is ongoing in Gaza. Now, I think at first glance, this article is going to come across as very, very critical of Israeli military tactics. But I think as you get through it, bear with me here, or just check out the article on your own, you're going to see that the authors here also recognize that Israel's in a tough spot because Hamas intentionally hides amongst the civilian populations. Now, this article titled "A Mass Assassination Factory Inside Israel's Calculated Bombing of Gaza" was put together by 972 Magazine, which is an independent online nonprofit magazine run by a group of Palestinian and Israeli journalists. This article was published on November 30th, 2023, and I'll put a link in the description for anybody interested in checking it out. The authors say that they based this article on conversations with 7 current and former members of Israel's intelligence community, including military intelligence and Air Force personnel who were involved in Israeli operations in the besieged Gaza Strip. In addition, they have Palestinian testimonies, data, and documentation from the Gaza Strip, as well as official statements by the IDF spokesperson and other Israeli state institutions. So diving right in, they say, this is going to kind of the shock factor right out the gate. "Nothing happens by accident," said one source. "When a 3-year-old girl is killed in a home in Gaza, it's because someone in the army decided it wasn't a big deal for her to be killed, that it was a price worth paying in order to hit another target. We are not Hamas. These are not random rockets. Everything is intentional. We know exactly how much collateral damage there will be in every home." This is one of those situations where, like, I don't know what's better and what's worse, right? I think back to times during the Russia and Ukraine war where a Russian missile would strike like a playground, and you would have some people saying that the Russian missiles were so inaccurate that they were just hitting everything, and others saying, no, they were deliberately targeting the playground. I don't know the worst part there, right? It's the same thing here. Would you rather hear that the civilians are dying because of inaccuracies in the munitions, or that the civilians are dying because they are recognized as acceptable collateral damage? I mean, 0 civilians being killed is the answer. We're going to get to that here in a moment. The article says that another source said that senior intelligence officers told his officers after October 7th that the goal was to, quote, "kill as many Hamas operatives as possible," end quote, for which the criteria around harming Palestinian civilians were significantly relaxed. As such, there are cases in which we shell based on a wide cellular pinpointing of where the target is, killing civilians. This is often done to save time instead of doing a little more work to get a more accurate pinpointing, said the source. This targeting based off of cell data is something that is also happening in Ukraine near the front. It is regular on both sides. A soldier or a group of soldiers would use their cell phones. It would pop up. The other side would identify that and fire shells against that position. We haven't really seen that utilized in this sort of mixed environment where there are militants mixed with civilians in such a dense urban setting. The technology has existed for a long period of time, and the U.S. could have used it for targeting in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, but due to the civilian casualty considerations, we didn't. This source here is saying that one of the ways that Israel is targeting Hamas in Gaza is just through that. Continuing, they say the targets in Gaza that have been struck by Israeli aircraft can be divided roughly into 4 categories. The first is tactical targets, which include standard military targets such as armed militant cells, weapon warehouses, rocket launchers, anti-tank missile launchers, launch pits, mortar bombs, military headquarters, observation posts, and so on. Genuine military targets. Nobody's going to argue that, right? You see one of these targets, that target is struck. I think around the world, people are going to say, got it, no problem there. The next few get a little tricky. The second, they say, are underground targets, mainly tunnels that Hamas has dug under Gaza's neighborhoods, including under civilian homes. And we're going to come back to that here in a little bit. The third, they say, and there's going to be a lot of time focused on this one, are called power targets, which they say include high-rises and residential towers in the heart of cities and public buildings such as universities, banks, and government offices. The idea behind hitting such targets is that a deliberate attack on Palestinian society will exert civil pressure on Hamas. That's up for debate. I feel like no matter what conflict you look at, you can find examples of where trying to pressure the civilian population by hitting civilian infrastructure has not always worked out. Again, to go back to Ukraine and Russia, it was just a few months ago people were saying that Russia should not be targeting the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, and that by doing so was not going to break the Ukrainian people, but was going to steel their resolve to continue fighting. And in that time, people were pointing to World War II and how Nazi Germany attacked the citizens of Europe and attacked Great Britain, and how that didn't collapse the Allies, but instead steeled their resolve. It's hard to see how that would be so drastically different here. Then they say the final category consists of family homes or operatives' homes. The stated purpose of these attacks is to destroy private residents in order to assassinate a single resident suspected of being a Hamas or Islamic Jihad operative. I think it's fair to group in any of the militant groups in Gaza at this point. Israel's not just going after Hamas. They're not just going after Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but any of the associated groups that were involved in the October 7th attacks or continue to fight Israeli forces. On that note, with attacking some of these structures and civilian homes, they say, quote, Hamas is everywhere in Gaza. There is no building that does not have something of Hamas in it. So if you want to find a way to turn a high-rise into a target, you will be able to do so, said one former intelligence official. The argument that's somewhat made throughout this piece is that Israel is kind of using this loose targeting to just decimate the entire area. As in, a Hamas operative may have had a meeting at one point in one building, and that opens it up for targeting. That is, again, one of the arguments being put forward here. They say, quote, the perception is that it really hurts Hamas when high-rise buildings are taken down because it creates a public reaction in the Gaza Strip and scares the population, says one of the sources. Quote, they wanted to give the citizens of Gaza the feeling that Hamas is not in control of the situation. Sometimes they topple buildings and sometimes postal service and government buildings, end quote. I think it's pretty clear at this point that Hamas is not in complete control of the situation in Gaza. Israel's been striking at will since October 7th, anywhere along the Strip, complete and total air superiority, striking at times 24 hours around the clock. And again, part of the claim they're making here is that it's not just the Hamas targets, but that Israel is showcasing this dominance by being able to strike whatever they want, including some civilian infrastructure. But real quick, thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Sonoran Desert Institute. If you've ever wanted to learn more about gunsmithing, firearms repair, or shooting sports management, SDI is worth checking out. The online programs at SDI cover armorers courses, gunsmithing, ballistics, woodworking and finishes, shooting sports management, and more. Plus, tools and materials are shipped to your door for hands-on practice. SDI is DEAC recognized and can be a great way to kickstart a career you're actually interested in. Visit sdi.edu or call 480-999-4767 to learn more. Then they talk a little bit about the policy of roof knocking that has been brought up really at the early days of this war, not as much in the last couple weeks. But the policy there was that a small munition would be dropped on the roof of a building, tapping it, right, and giving the civilians inside a warning to get out before a large munition was dropped and destroying part or all of the building. In a conversation here, or quoting Israeli Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Brigadier General Tischler, he says that there has been a shift in that policy, saying that it's no longer in use, quote, where there is an enemy, roof knocking is a term that is relevant to rounds of fighting and not to war. So it's kind of suggesting that that is for the occasional strike against Hamas in Gaza, not during an all-out war like they're fighting right now. The article continues saying that some of the sources talk about how attacking power targets was originally intended to shock Gaza, but not necessarily to kill large numbers of civilians. They say, quote, the targets were designed with the assumption that high rises would be evacuated of people. So when we were working on compiling the targets, there was no concern whatsoever regarding how many civilians would be harmed. The assumption was that that number would always be zero, said one source with deep knowledge of the tactic. Continuing, they said, quote, this would mean that there would be a total evacuation of the targeted buildings, which takes 2 to 3 hours, during which the residents are called by phone to evacuate, warning missiles are fired, and we also cross-check with drone footage that people are indeed leaving the high-rise, the source added. Now, look, there's no way that's ever going to be perfect. It's in the middle of a city. There's civilians there. There's people that might not be able to evacuate or don't want to evacuate or whatever it is, and you can never confirm just from a drone overhead that every possible civilian is out of the area. But what this article is getting at is that while that used to be a tactic widely used across Gaza, it has not been used very much in the past couple weeks. They did try to get some statements from the IDF in some of this. They said the IDF spokesperson did not address comments about specific attacks, but more generally stated that the IDF provides warnings before attacks in various ways, and when the circumstance allow it, also deliver individual warnings through phone calls to people who are at or near the targets. Adding that in general, the IDF works to reduce harm to civilians as part of the attacks as much as possible, despite the challenge of fighting a terrorist organization that uses the citizens of Gaza as human shields. And, like I said, there's a part of this I think that we've hit on already that really is incriminating for Israel, honestly, to show how much of the civilian infrastructure is being targeted, deliberately so, in a way to kind of intimidate the civilian population. But they're also going to get into the challenges here that Israel faces because Hamas is doing this intentionally. They are putting themselves amongst civilians because they understand what that does for their cause in a positive way for Hamas at the cost of Palestinian lives. The article continues saying, according to these sources, there are degrees of collateral damage, according to which the Army determines whether it is possible to attack a target inside a private residence. Quote, when the general directive becomes collateral damage 5, that means we are authorized to strike all targets that will kill 5 or less civilians. We can act on all target files that are 5 or less, said one of the sources. That's not as cold as that sounds, or as cold as this is going to sound. That's a reality in warfare. Again, one of the awful things in war is that collateral damage is a thing. And especially when fighting some of these dispersed terrorist organizations, there is going to be collateral damage. The United States has calculations like this as well. I don't know that I've seen it put in that precise of terms. Usually it's a pretty complicated process to figure out when and how it is acceptable to strike a target. The article here is presenting that since October 7th, these restrictions have loosened quite a bit. One of the sources said, quote, in my time, if the house I was working on was marked collateral damage 5, it would not always be approved for attack. Such approval, he said, would only be received if a senior Hamas commander was known to be living in his home. So prior to October 7th, they would only get that go-ahead to, recognizing that 5 civilians or more would die in the attack so long as a senior commander was killed. Not the case right now. He said, quote, to my understanding, today they can mark all of the houses of any Hamas military operative regardless of rank. The source continued, that is a lot of houses. Hamas members who don't really matter for anything live in homes all across Gaza, so they mark the home and bomb the house and kill everyone there. Again, one of the challenges here is, and what they're getting at, is that it might not even be their home. It might just be a place they've held meetings in the past, but it pops up on a target list associated with Hamas. That doesn't even mean that the militant is there at the time of the attack and it becomes a target. And I understand there's going to be more later talking about how precise Israel tries to be with some of these strikes. But if you look at the damage and the devastation across Gaza, it's very hard to say that, entire blocks aren't being targeted, right? There's entire city blocks in ruins. And the argument that Israel has put forward is that everything there is being used by Hamas in some way, shape, or form. I think this article does a good job of kind of threading the needle there and saying, kind of, but only if you really loosen those restrictions and say that a meeting location one time or the home of a lower level Hamas operative becomes a legitimate military target. Continuing on, they did get some feedback from the IDF. A quote from the spokesperson said, quote, the IDF is committed to international law and acts according to it, and in doing so attacks military targets and does not attack civilians. The terrorist organization Hamas places its operatives and military assets in the heart of the civilian population. Hamas systematically uses the civilian population as a human shield and conducts combat from civilian buildings, including sensitive sites such as hospitals, mosques, schools, and UN facilities. And then going back to some of the sources used for this article that spoke with 972, they said that in many cases, Hamas deliberately endangers the civilian population in Gaza and tries to forcefully prevent civilians from evacuating, understanding that Israeli harm to civilians gives Hamas legitimacy in the fighting. Look, it's easy, though not necessarily appropriate, for someone like me sitting in the safety of my own home to criticize how countries are executing a war that they believe is in the best interest of their people. It's just, they're making life or death decisions day in and day out with serious ramifications if they make the wrong move. I just, I think articles like this are worth diving into every so often to recognize that it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray here. It would be great if every single Israeli bomb only killed Hamas terrorists and there were zero civilian casualties. That is also not how Hamas has established their presence in Gaza. Hamas has made it impossible for Israel to completely eradicate that organization without any civilian casualties. Then, of course, you can get into the argument of should Israel be doing more, less, or the same in terms of avoiding civilian casualties and how much of that burden sits on Hamas. But either way, again, I think it's a conversation. As this war continues to rage, I think it's a conversation we need to keep top of mind. It's important, not just to Israel, not just to the Palestinian people, but to all of us around the world. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description below. Substack now also has ad-free, sponsor-free videos published about 1 hour before they go live on YouTube. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.